speaking or spoken through, examining the agency of medieval visionary women. There's a difference between speaking and being spoken through. Many late medieval women, such as Julian of Norwich and Bridget of Sweden, wrote about their experiences of independent, direct communication with God. However, religious tropes like passive humility and human fallibility can reduce the agency of the visionary in the text, threatening to render them nothing more than a recipient or conduit for religious teachings. Margery Kempe, for example, is referred to as this creature rather than her name, and Julian of Norwich is but a woman, lewd, feeble and frail. Through this paper, I seek to evaluate how female visionary communion, as represented in texts by women, allows or denies space for the woman to exist as an active speaker. I'm interested in the portrayal of the direct relationship with God, as well as how the woman's relation to the Western Catholic Church may influence this portrayal. An important recurrence is the inexpressibility of this quite literal communion. In the words of Margery Kempe, she might never express it with her words like as she felt it in her soul. Looking at Mechthild of Hackeborn, Bridget of Sweden, Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe, I will focus on the use of light as a literal and metaphysical conduit for God, exploring the way it bridges the inexpressible experiential boundary between vision and text. I will also consider how this relationship changes depending on the visionary's proximity to the church. First, a brief overview of these four women. Margery Kempe lived approximately between 1373 and 1438, and the Book of Margery Kempe is considered the first autobiography in the English language. The full text survives in a single manuscript, British Library Additional Manuscript 61823, also known as the Salthouse Manuscript. Heavily censored extracts also exist in two short pamphlets by Wynkyn de Worde in 1501 and Henry Pepwell in 1521. An anchoress at St. Julian's Church in Norwich, Julian lived approximately between 1342 and 1416. Her text, Revelations of Divine Love, details 16 visions that came to her on her sickbed in 1373. Revelations exists in two versions. The short text, composed shortly after her visions, survives in the 15th century British Library Additional 37790. The long text is a more meditative expansion written some 20 years later. It survives fully in 3 manuscripts and extracts are in a further 2. Bridget of Sweden lived between 1303 and 1373. One of the more famous mystics, her Revelation survives in multiple manuscripts in Swedish, Latin, Middle English, Italian and more. Pictured here are just the manuscripts listed in the Bodleian libraries. Her name returns 60 results in Dutch collections, 322 in the German Manuscripta Medievalia database, and a further 42 in the rudimentary Swedish database Manuscripta.se. Not to be confused with Mechthild of Magdeburg, her fellow nun in the convent of Helfta. Mechthild of Hackeborn was born in 1240 or 1241 and lived until 1298. Her visions were recorded by her sisters without her knowledge into 7 books. So, to what extent are these women portrayed as active speakers in their respective works? First, I will look at the ways their visions are conveyed before exploring how these expressions may differ depending on their relationship with the institutional church. This folio from Pierpont Morgan Library manuscript M498 depicts Bridget of Sweden communing with Jesus and the Virgin Mary through rays of light. The Trinitarian composition maintained in a sister manuscript, now in The Hague, is cut through by the rays of light and makes Bridget the focal point. Light imagery is used in the works of all 4 women to express their inexpressible visions. It's an intangible but easily understood concept and an effective tool to describe a metaphysical connection. Inextricably linked with knowledge and discovery, particularly in religious works, light enables both literal and spiritual enlightenment. The word occurs 13 times in chapter 1 of Genesis. Let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that light was good. In James 1:17, God is also referred to as the Father of light. Bonaventure's Itinerarium references James 1:17 and describes ascension in terms of illumination. Inherent in this is a sense of transfiguration. Just as John Scotius Eriugena says, all things which are light, Bernard of Clairvaux takes this further, describing how the air, radiant with sunbeams, seems not so much to be illuminated as to be light itself. This transfiguration allows for a metaphysical, if not physical, connection to be established. These are all works that our women mystics would likely have known. Indeed, Bonaventure is referenced in Margery's book, and Bernard of Clairvaux was a favoured theologian of Mechthild of Hackeborn and her fellow sisters at Helfta. In the Middle English version of Mechthild's Liber, from him streamed out to each person in the choir a sunbeam. Just as the sun gives light to all the world, right so I lighten and make bright each man that comes to me with the light of knowing. This light of knowing from Christ brings enlightenment and even endorsement, but it is not directed at Mechthild. Here, she is a passive viewer of other people's relationships with God. Light is used to comprehend and express intangible metaphysical connections, something reiterated later in the text where Mechthild experiences a clarity which may not be showed by speech, and a wonderful shining came out from the face of our Lord. Truth and certainty in that truth are fundamentally tied to light, providing clarity. But this is still caveated by an inexpressibility topos, that which may not be shown by speech. Similarly, in Bridget's Revelations, Christ explicitly says that he speaks for the sake and knowledge and instruction of this bride here, who cannot perceive spiritual things except by means of physical ones. In the same book, the devil says to Christ, I see a kind of bond of fire descending from you to her, that ties her heart so much to you that she thinks of and loves nothing but you. This observation declares a tangible bond between Bridget the individual and God that extends beyond the discrete, real-time nature of vision. Julian, meanwhile, differentiates between vision and comprehension. In the short text, she says, the bodily sight stinted or stopped, and the ghostly sight dwelled in my understanding. However, in the long text, this is expanded to, all this was shown in three ways. That is to say, by bodily sight, and by words formed in my understanding, and by ghostly sight. But I cannot nor may not show the spiritual sight as openly nor as fully as I would wish to do. The description of bodily sight in the long text confirms a physical element to her visions, but Julian also uses it as a disclaimer, frequently couching her observations in the phrase, to my sight, to suggest human fallibility and the potentially subjective nature of her visions. She frequently describes the experience as a passive one. It was brought to my mind, it was showed to me, reminding us of her description of herself as an unlettered woman, lewd, feeble, and frail. Bridget's revelations, on the other hand, rarely give her a voice at all. As Bridget Morris notes, a third of the visions in Book 1 are Christ speaking directly with no mention of an interlocutor. This removal of the visionary from the text decreases Bridget's agency, but paradoxically allows her voice to be heard, allows her visions to be heard. Morris explicitly labels Bridget as a conduit of Christ's word, cast in a role as God's intermediary on earth, which authorizes her to speak forth boldly. The content of the text becomes the focus for the reader, unhindered by any prejudice about the female visionary herself. There's more to cover than I have time for today, and more women to consider. Hildegard von Bingen, for example, is shown here, receiving a fiery vision from God. Mechthild von Magdeburg's visions were also recorded in a collection literally called The Flowing Light of the Godhead. Later depictions of Bridget of Sweden by Niccolo di Tommaso show conduits of light now rendered into words. These images aren't high resolution enough for me to transcribe, but this does reinforce the idea of light being used as a metaphysical conduit for communication. These are all areas I hope to research in more detail, but for now they hopefully serve to show how women choose to express their direct relationship with God. The desire for a personal religious experience that reinforces a faith instilled by the Church is not uncommon. Julian explicitly desired 3 graces: to have mind of Christ's passion, bodily sickness, and 3 wounds. She says, "I would after, because of that showing, have the more true mind in the passion of Christ." These 3 graces augment Julian's faith, even making it purer and more accurate. However, any visionary experience has the potential to either validate or contradict the Church's teachings. An individual, non-corroborated experience by a woman can easily be read as a circumvention of the Church as a communal, endorsed, masculine institution. So, how does a woman's relationship with the Church affect the portrayal and reception of her visions? And what effect does this have on the presence of the visionary voice in the text? Each of these women has a different relationship with the Church, which inevitably affects the expression and reception of their experiences. Julian was an anchoress, Mechthild a Benedictine nun. Bridget was nobility, descended from royalty, and was the first woman in the Western Church to found a religious order. Margery Kempe, in contrast, was a middle-class laywoman, arrested several times, accused of nullity, and even abandoned by fellow pilgrims who found her affected piety too infuriating. Margery's mysticism is the most explicitly unorthodox in its presentation. As Mary Morse states, she not only writes from outside the ecclesiastical textual tradition, but receives her visions outside the sanctioned enclosure of the cloister. As such, she is seen as a threat. She brings religion, or at least her religion, into the public sphere and is accused of public preaching. A double sin, as women preaching and public preaching were both heretical at the time. Yet she counters, "I preach not, sir, I come in no pulpit." In no pulpit she may be, but she still invokes an authoritative power by acting as a medium between the laity and God. In one of her visions, Jesus says, "Do as I bid thee, for I am above the Holy Church." Margery invokes divine permission to explicitly circumvent the Church, transferring the power of preaching out of the pulpit and into a secular setting. A major narrative driver of her book is her persecution. Margery's cast as a radical, accused of being a false loller, a false hypocrite, and I would argue that this persecution is largely due to her secular position. Figures such as Julian and Bridget are venerated and later sanctified, but Margery is labelled a false strumpet, a false loller, and a false deceiver of the people. Here, her accuser, the Mayor of Leicester, conflates sexual and religious transgression. She is unable to escape both her gender and her secular status. Margery makes a sanctity of this persecution, but it's important to note that nothing she says is particularly unorthodox. Perhaps surprisingly, she still sees herself within the context of the Church. In one of her visions, Christ calls her a pillar of the Holy Church, as visually represented here in the marginalia of the manuscript itself. Clarissa Atkinson notices that her experience was personal and extraordinary, but she took it immediately to the Church for acceptance and sanction. She may experience her religion in an unorthodox fashion, but she then seeks comfort and validation in the Church. While Margery experiences varying degrees of conflict with different representatives of the Church, Julian and Mechthild are already endorsed by the institution they inhabit. In one vision from Mechthild's Liber, our Lord said, "This vineyard is my Catholic Church, in which for 33 years I laboured with my sweat. Do thou labour with me in this vineyard." And she said, "How?" To whom the Lord replied, "By watering it." This is an explicit conversation between Christ and Mechthild, wherein she is commanded to water, nurture, and support the Church from the inside. Rather than circumventing or being above it, Mechthild is told to dedicate herself to it. Similarly, as an anchoress, both spiritually and geographically tied to the Church, Julian's visions augment their teachings rather than circumventing them. As already mentioned, her revelations are frequently passive and reinforce her humility, particularly the short text, which Watson believes is held back by its commitment to orthodoxy. Julian does explicitly desire her sickness so that she may truthfully and faithfully be located within her church's faith. Quote, so that I might, in the sickness, take all my rights of the Holy Church, expecting that I should die. However, Julian may well not have been an anchoress at the time of her visions. People were present at her sickbed in 1371, including her mother and a priest, suggesting that either she was a laywoman at the time, or that the life of an anchoress was more lenient than we tend to assume. If she was a laywoman, does this recast her as more of an outsider, circumventing the church as Margery does? Even so, it's worth noting the ways in which other people attempt to recast Margery too. Wynkyn de Word's 1501 pamphlet, 18 times shorter than the book, removes Margery almost entirely, and most of the text is direct speech from Christ, similar to Bridget's revelations. Henry Pepwell's 1521 edition labels her a devout anchoress, an attempt to contextualize Margery within the church and legitimize her experience. In the full book itself, a monk says, I would thou were enclosed in a house of stone, that there should no man speak with thee. Contemporary cultural reception, then, varies largely depending on the individual's position in relation to orthodoxy. A monk seeks to silence her, Pepwell wants to legitimize her, but both want to place her in a more orthodox space, both physically and socially. Both want to confine her, lend power to the church, and make her spoken through rather than actively speaking. As Foster says, far from erasing Margery Kempe and removing her safely into the private sphere where she could do no harm, Pepwell's identification of Kempe as an anchoress placed her very much in the middle of things. Ultimately, I'd suggest that the closer to the church the visionary is, the less agency she is afforded, as her words are taken to be those of the institution rather than the individual. Margery represents a push back against the patriarchal church, but the other three women attempt to exert their independence from inside out. It's also worth noting it's not just the act of communion, but also the act of textual composition that is contextualized in imagery of light and mediation. When Mechthild asks God how she can be sure that her sisters have reported her visions correctly, he says, it is through me they are able to comprehend what thou sayest. I am also in their mouth when they speak of it. Then she saw 3 rays of light from the divine heart fall onto the 2 persons who wrote this book. It's easy to say that the agency of the women we've looked at today is limited by the fact they are ventriloquising the word of God. But while they may at times be shown to be passive, they have active voices in the way they talk about their experiences, in the way they describe that connection with God. Furthermore, the very survival of the manuscripts themselves also shows that they were received, whether well or not, by the public. Just by writing these texts down, we know these women's names. There was certainly an audience for them, though to varying degrees. In any case, the 4 texts explored today demonstrate the very real common existence of autonomous women thinkers with their own gendered religious experiences to express. I just want to end on this beautiful picture of St Mary's Church in Wiltshire, which I think very well encapsulates the Bernard of Clairvaux quote from the beginning, where the air, radiant with sunbeams, seems not so much to be illuminated as to be light itself. Thank you very much.